this diagram?
I thought you could do in theater.
Can you tell what those are?
Yeah. Elephants.
Okay, elephants, right? So what does the baby elephant have to know about the big elephant to survive? How to stay close, okay. What else? Where to get its food. How to navigate the world. To trust. What's that they're being led by bigger elephants? Yes.
You offer, that's a very profound question, right? Isn't it a matter of learning everything an elephant needs to do in order to be an elephant?
The baby elephant has to know everything. Everything about being an elephant. It has to know which elephants are the nice elephants, which ones are the bad elephants, which ones do you hang out with. They have to understand the moods of elephants, right? So when is this person in this mood or that mood, or blah, 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 blah. What does the big elephant have to know about the baby elephant? That it doesn't know that it's anything or that it's there. What else? How to recognize its needs. How not to trample it, right?
How to protect it.
So how to protect it. How to have patience, right? You guys have some very self-aware big elephants, right? Big elephants oftentimes don't have to have any consideration really for the young elephant. And so I heard a couple of times that people said things like, we can't find so-called people of color or minority folks to hire and that kind of stuff. And I think that's interesting. Because this big elephant, let's start here. 1860. What happened in 1863? That should be of importance, should be at the top of our memory. 1863. 13th Amendment actually is 1365 or 1366, depending on if you're talking about the ratification or the submission. 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation, right? Which then is ratified in 65. So the Emancipation Proclamation says we have these bond people, we're going to set them free. So we fast forward to a strategy called Plessy versus Ferguson. And what was Plessy versus Ferguson? We have free people now in 1865, 1866 with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Then we have Plessy versus Ferguson. And what was Plessy versus Ferguson? You can Google. Feel free to Google. Separate but equal, right? So separate but equal. So now we go, and that's, and so we have separate but equal. And then in 1954, we have something that's very interesting. This is, I'm leading you to something by talking about this. What happens in 1954? Brown versus the Board of Education, which now outlaws or reverses Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So in 1953, what did schools look like? What did they look like?
White.
So schools were white?
Or not, but they were not together.
So there were black schools, and who taught in those black schools? Black teachers. And there were white schools, And who taught in those white schools? White teachers. Did white teachers ever teach in black schools? No. Did white teachers ever teach? Did black teachers ever teach in white schools? No. So let me finish the. So 1953, we have black teachers teaching in black schools, white teachers teaching in white schools. 1954, the laws change. What does 1955 look like? What does 1955 look like? White teachers with black students. What do we call that? She said stupid. What do we call that? We call that integration. That was the desegregation plan, right? So so what's the problem today? We say we can't find black teachers. So my wife is Native. She's a Assiniboine. My daughter has one of those funny cards with her blood quantum on it, and she qualifies for some things, but her children will not be able to have membership in the tribe because of her blood quantum. And our family, so our family signed a treaty with the United States that, so my wife and her sisters own like maybe 4,000 acres of land in Montana. Just absolutely ridiculous amount of land. But the tribe made a deal with the United States of America, and they agreed to not farm the land for 15 years. Now the 15 years is up. Now they've gotten the payment, so they made arrangements to say, we'll get paid for 15 years. The tribe will get paid, and we won't do that, and so we'll get that check, right? So 15 years is up now. It's over. So now they can farm the land. What's the problem? They don't know how to. What else? It costs a lot of money to farm. The machinery is expensive, right? So the infrastructure has been sucked out of this community that even if they wanted to be on a so-called even playing field, they haven't had the infrastructure. What I would suggest is that oftentimes when we talk about our inability to get people to come to our organization, to participate in our organization, the real question isn't that those people aren't out there. The question is, how have we built our organizations to support that infrastructure that meets their needs, right? There was no problem in 53 finding black teachers. But you'll hear school districts today say, we can't find them. Where did they go? Did they evaporate? No, there was a structure that was in place that allowed them to be a part of that society. And then when we did this DSEC thing, we just totally messed it up. I think it's interesting that the Choice is Yours program works one way, right? So kids from North Minneapolis can go to Edina. But would a kid from Edina go to North Minneapolis? So when we think about structures in our organizations, we have to think about how and how we built those things and how they play out in reality. So we'll hit some of that stuff. Let's take a 5-minute break just to kind of get up and move. We'll come back. We'll get right into our handout and get this ball rolling. All right. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that you literally put the elephant in the room.
Which oh yes.
Yeah, you're a pretty good job.
Both of them. Thank you.
Both elephants.
There's a it's more on deserts.
Yeah.
And so they're in theory,
Are you in Minnesota?
if there were racially defined communities that have access to health, do they? And they found that they don't.
instead of saying, after all these generations of lack of access, do they know how to cook these things? Do you know what I mean? It's like we all have
No,
it just came out like this month.
So here's something that's funny, and I don't know if your family does this, but we have Friday.
Yeah.
So it's an evening dish, right?
Well, not really.
And that's the thing, right?
It's
So,
what was rations on
right,
reservation.
it was part of
Because it
what
was military rations.
right, and it became
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
When in fact, that's not.
It's not, right,
That's not a part.
Yeah.
That's never been a part of
Yeah.
what our family does. And so we've been trying to unwind some of that stuff that was put upon us, and then we did it so often and we said
Right. Right.
You know what I mean?
I'm just loving it.
And so I tell people all the time, we don't ever think about it. We don't think about it. They go through. But when you are in a society that is largely believers in something, right. And so as a Black person who doesn't believe in God, where the Christian faith is so interwoven in our culture, you know what I mean? But the church played a big role in the civil rights movement. So it's like, yeah, right. It's it is been social suicide. It's just one reason why I'm like, I had the money. I lived away from Mississippi for about 13 years. But when I went back in 2007, I was like, I can't do this. And everywhere goes, state functions, there's prayer. And I believe in separation of church and state. Like some things just don't go on in a public school system, whatever. But it was just, you say that and it's like social suicide. And so it was really an alienating experience. Right. And when I moved here, I only knew the people that interviewed me. So I'm like literally having to like rebuild my life. So going, if you look at the people I met, like this, you know, with also interesting, I wouldn't have had that first group of friends because I didn't feel welcome in Black community settings. Like I would meet Black people, and they invite me to their church, you know, and then at some point you just have to stay, and then it's like, so it's been tough. You can over my identity is very really open. Yeah, when he was wide open, right? You can't run for governor. There's a lot of you can't run for governor. It's in the law. Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's just about slavery. They never changed it in the state constitution. Isn't that crazy? It's just, so it's like, I'm like, so that's why for me, I can't, when I mention intersectionality, I can't separate it because there's so many things of Black atheists has a totally different experience of Black atheists, and it's still hard being an atheist because we're 12, 13 months. But to be Black and atheist is like, it's tough. And so I also started another group for Black LGBTQ atheists. So because that's another piece, like you meet people that are gay or lesbian, trans, but they're still believers, and so they're still looking at you like funny. How can you not, how could you, so it's like all this. And so that group is like 50 something, and it's national, and we talk about just the complexity of our identities. I tell my mom all the time, like, I wish I could just wake up and magically believe what you believe. Is she forgiving yet? She is, but I think, so we have this dynamic where if anything bad happens in my life, or I'm upset about anything, it's because I'm atheist. Like, and I'm like, so what's the explanation when you go through tough times, when you have a struggle, So she really thinks that I'm bringing some curse on myself. So we kind of bump heads over that, and I just kind of condition myself to, if I'm going through something, I just don't talk to her or keep conversating quick, because I already know it's gonna, she just named me for life. a while, almost a year. And then we kind of slowly started talking again. It was the elephant in the room for us was that we had never gotten any resolution or had a follow-up conversation for the big blow-up argument.
What do you think is harder for her? You have to know your boyfriend.
Atheism for sure. Because I think she can reconcile in her mind that I can be in a sinful relationship but still love God, but that's just not sin. You know, I think not believing in God is blasphemy, and that's, you know, you're going to burn in hell. I think that's her whole thing. The thought that her child is going to burn in hell.
I know it's tough. Being a mom is my toughest job in the world. It is. It's most important too. I mean, I gotta say, it's when I treasure the most. But I got 4 kids, 6 grandchildren. But it's my daughter came out to me. We were having dinner, and we were supposed to go to a concert, and it was like, well, let's have a bottle of wine.
All right, so
It was a surprise. I didn't expect it. But I can imagine.
I forgot to set a timer. So how close are we to 5 minutes?
Oh, we're done.
Great. Okay. Oh, so there may be lines. Okay. So then I'll take this time to just kind of make an announcement. Is I didn't think about lines to the restroom and that kind of thing. So there are 2 groups of individuals that are in the room. There are folks who've signed up for the series of trainings, and then folks who signed up just for today. So if you have the expectation that you'll get all the answers in the 2 hours that we have left, I will disappoint you. However, we do have 5 other sessions that we will really chop these things apart and really try to make these as practical as possible. And so today is one of those the launching point for the rest of the series. So I encourage you to sign up for the series. And I would be remiss if I didn't go to your handout and let's go to page 3. And we're pretty sophisticated individuals. We know how to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. But I did want to give us some practical ways to think about how we either organize spaces where we either have trainings or workshops in terms of how do we set the tone or a set of ground rules for that. Again, this is we are collaborators in this process. And so I set here a few simple ground rules that have been helpful to me in terms of having conversations where people can be respected, even if there's not agreement on things. And then there is this idea of respect. I don't know if has anyone used the acronym for respect as you see it here, that each letter of respect represents a value or a way of thinking about having shared space together. And then there is the 4 Agreements by Don Ruiz. Anyone read that book, The 4 Agreements? Right. I find his 4 agreements in terms of how we can interact with each other extremely helpful. Right. That we're impeccable with our word. That we don't take anything personally. That we don't make assumptions about other people, and that we always are doing our best. And so if I can agree to those things that I'm doing, I actually can start looking for those same things from other people. And so these are some ways to really kind of sit down and talk about the creation of your values as you get together in groups. If you flip to page 4, I want to spend a little bit of time, probably about 10 minutes, really having us think about how we got started in this field or how it is that we think about this field. And so before we touch this paper, what you have in front of you is a deck of cards. And if you guys want, you can choose to be your own group, or you can choose to go to another table and do this activity because there's just 2 of you. Okay? But in the center of your table, it's a deck of cards. And what I'd like for you to do is, so I will say that it's not designed to be offensive. It is designed for marketing purposes. The concept of freedom, these are freedom cards, marketing. But what I'd like for you to do is to open up those cards, select one of those cards, read it, and then have everyone respond to that card. And when you're done with that card, you can draw another. Or another way to approach it is you can flip through the cards and see which one you want to address. I am not a fascist of how you use these cards, but I want you to spend about 10 minutes really thinking about your journey, and those cards should help with that conversation. All right? So I'll see you back in 10 minutes. No, 15 minutes. Let's do 15 minutes.
Move beyond.
Yes. So if you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. All right, thank you so much. It is clear you could have gone on for the rest of the time with that particular tool. She said, do we get to keep these? Marketing. No, I can make those available to you. So anyone who's interested. The deck actually is made up of about 50 cards. So I split those in half because I did. So what did you find interesting about or engaging about the cards themselves? Yes.
Even though some of the questions were very common to address it.
Okay, so it makes you walk into your truth. All right. Cool. What were those questions really focused on? No matter what kind of what the angle was. What was the angle of the questions, if you will? Your own experience, right? Your own experience. Why, in terms of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, is your own experience important? Can you say that louder?
Because we've all been hurt.
So in some ways, we've been hurt in very similar ways. What else? Why else is that important? So if you don't know that you have goggles on, you can't take them off. Yes.
It pulls out some of the socialization that some of the questions that we answered that we talked about today was that is kind of rooted in that true socialization. Hold that.
So that pull for you to really look at your socialization. I heard a voice, yes. You can only speak your truth.
What I love about sharing it and sharing with people who have different experiences is that it helps you see something that you never see otherwise.
All right. Seen in them or in yourself?
And maybe both.
Okay.
In this line of work, there's always, feels like to me that always emphasizes
them, or like, I'm not racist, but I've heard other people, there's always this sense of divide, and you put yourself in that conversation, kind of acknowledge and further bias. It kind of helps, I think, further the conversation, people who feel more confident.
Yeah.
I think the entire process is there, the toxic bias. Like, it's almost like you can't do it without fully the toxins out of your own body. And it's also in a way that it's honest. Because it's like, well, you can see yourself in other people, and you can see like the similarity, you can just the bias. It's good.
Good thing. Yes.
For me, in all the stories, in particular with mine, there was I saw a sense of beauty and a sense of ugliness or good and bad, however you want to look at it. It wasn't one or the other, no matter what our story was or my story was. Like, beauty in that, there's not beauty in that. So I didn't go to one or the other.
Yes.
I think these questions kind of get at for that. I'm using having these conversations with people who are and practicing it.
Cool. Yes.
I think for me, and not so much just right now at this table, but continuously asking these kinds of questions has gone beyond the whole sense of I'm not a racist thing, to understanding that I am a racist. I was socialized to be racist. So how do I wake up every day and find the tools to combat that so I can be a racist and a good human being? I mean, it's a
In recovery.
Yeah.
So one of I didn't take into account where I was. So I was in San Antonio, Texas, and I was doing a workshop, and I made a declaration very similar to the one that you made, trying to help us to recognize that racism is pervasive. It's in every aspect of our society. Therefore, if I'm engaging in the society that is racist and racism is pervasive, just by interacting with it, I don't smoke. I used to. I don't smoke currently. I used to smoke a tobacco pipe. It was the weirdest thing being 18 years old. It was just weird, right? But it's interesting that I don't smoke now. But when I walk in and out of places where the smoking area is right outside the door, what do I end up smelling like?
Like you smoke.
Like I smoke. I end up smelling like I smoke. And so I think it's helpful for us to have that as a metaphor to recognize that we're in a racist society, therefore we all are racist in some aspect. And so a black person stood up and was like, "There's no way I can be racist because I'm black." And I'm like, "No, that's not true. It's not true." Right? And so some of the stuff we have to undermine is recognizing that we are all human and we're frail, right? So there's a couple of methodologies that were mentioned. Like one is the People's Institute, right, for Survival and Beyond. Have people heard of that place? I was a trained facilitator in the 90s. I was like their poster child. And one of the things that they taught me in that time, and it was important for me to recognize that in the 90s, right? But they taught me that prejudice plus power equals racism. And so since as a black person, I didn't have power, I could not be racist. But I can't understand the racism that I have with people who are light-skinned or dark-skinned within my own community. How do I explain that if that's not? And so there are these methodologies that in their context were effective and necessary. But what do we know about context? It changes all the time. And so we have to continually adapt to those new contexts, right? I want to put this out here. I want you to think about this because it's kind of interesting to think about. That there will become a time in human history where men and women, either in the gender binary or gender plurality, will use the same restroom facilities at the exact same time. It will happen.
You do it at home.
She said, we do it at home, right? Now here's something that is a noodle twister, right? So when I'm in front of groups and I say that aren't as evolved as we are, right? I get gasps of horror and I can't believe it. But that's the exact same thinking that people had about Black people and white people using the same kinds of facilities. And so no, context change, we have to adapt to those changes and recognize whether we want it to change or not, it's going to happen. One thing I'll say about the election of Donald Trump is that people actually thought that he would stop change, that he would revert back, but he can't stop change. It's inevitable. He can put some roadblocks for some folks or slow things down, but change is inevitable. It is going to happen. And so those are important things for us to recognize. And for folks who consider themselves to be progressive or liberal, that the change that you want is not going to happen as fast as you want. Because we're not in charge. We're human, right? So what I want you to do now is to spend some time thinking about yourself and your organization. So on page 4, there are some questions that I'd like for you to identify, page 4 and 5. Just want to highlight this idea of centralized. So if your diversity function is centralized, that means that it's really close to a function in the organization. So it would be either reporting directly to HR, to a manager of some sort, or is a function that is core to the organization. If it's decentralized, then you may be a program of the organization. So just outside of the key function of the organization. All right. Is that clear? No, it's not clear. Yeah. Okay. So a centralized function is anything that is either housed directly in whatever your headquarters is, right? That is something that would that directly impacts a budgetary item, that is that has resources allocated directly, has a manager, has specific things. Decentralized would be any program that is that would be programmatic. So things that are done that that aren't directly tied to that doesn't work. I'm trying to. Yes, correct. Yes. Or off to the side, yes. So that's a great way to talk about that, right? So centralized is that there's core leadership attached to it, budgets, resources. If it's off to the side, it's a program that we're doing this either as an outreach. It's a peripheral thing, but it's not a core part of the organization.
You bring somebody from the outside in to do it?
So sometimes you would bring someone from the outside in to do it if it is decentralized.
Centralized is in-house, decentralized is
that's one way. That's a great way to think about it as well. All right.
I like to think of outreach as two different things. Outreach.
Yes, outreach and inreach. Right. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to work through pages 4 and 5. Note to self, clarify. Just a couple more minutes. All right. What I'd like for you to do is at your table, take about 5 minutes and address any of those questions that you thought were interesting, and we'll bring it back to the group and we'll have a larger group discussion. But any of those questions that you thought were helpful or a good way to talk about it. You have 5 minutes. All right, great. So if we can bring our conversations back. So I want to thank you so much for sharing with each other. I would love to hear like some of the things that came up out of your group, but I want to hold that for your group. And so I want to kind of do this next leap into this thing. So is anyone familiar with Simon Sinek? Anyone ever read any of his books? Starts with why. So one of the things that I hope you're starting to hear is that this diversity, equity, and inclusion work really starts with you. And it starts with the question of why. And so how or why is your organization vested in doing DE&I work? And so those questions, we're really trying to get to this why. So Simon Sinek operates with this, he calls it the golden circle. You'll also hear it referred to as, well, the golden circle also applies to those cog shells that create the nexus, right? So it's an equilibrium where every part of the circle is in relationship to every other part of the circle, right? So I don't know if you've seen those nautiluses and the cutaways. So that's what he talks about is in terms of this golden circle. And he says that everything starts with why, right? So if you don't understand the why, then these other pieces become almost irrelevant. There were people who were more eloquent than, he uses this example in his book, that were more eloquent speakers than Martin Luther King. There were people who had, the civil rights had been going on long before Martin Luther King came on the scene, but he was able to give people a why that was cross-cultural, that was cross-economic backgrounds. He gave people a why that they could actually invest in themselves. And so when we talk about doing this kind of work, we need to think about why. Because often we go to the what, and we know, well, I guess people don't use iPods as much anymore. But for a while were there other, and it's funny because Guardians of the Galaxy picked up on the joke, right? Anybody see Guardians of the Galaxy 2, right? Love Guardians of the Galaxy 2. What was he using to listen to music? It was a Zoom, right? Does anybody remember Zooms, right? So that was Microsoft's iPod at the time. And so Apple was making iPods, and they still make iPods. Does Microsoft still make Zooms? No. Why? She said, why would they, right? So Microsoft was operating with a what, but not a why. Why is it that Apple still makes iPods? Because people buy them, they sell them, but why do people buy them? Because they want to be cool like Apple. Anything Apple sells is cool, and it's functional, and it's good. I have a master's in educational technology, and my daughter, who was 18 months at the time, picked up my iPad, punched in my code, swiped, went to her favorite app, and watch her thing. And I'm like, I have a master's in education, and I think I'm doing something, right? So this idea of why. And sometimes we jump directly to the what, and without the foundation of why, the what is of no purpose. So sometimes we do events. We'll have employees resource groups, or we will have brown bag diversity lunch conversations. But if we're not able to tie that back to a why, then it is just an activity. And we'll find in our organizations, if we're not able to attach it to a why, those programs get cut off. They get cut off, or they get marginalized. Or when we're looking at budgets, or we're looking at employees, those types of programs, any program that can't tie it right back to the why of the mission of the organization, in some respects, needs to be locked off, right? Well, whether we think it's a good thing or a good program, a noble program or not, but if it can't explain itself as to the why it's connected to the organization, that's important. That's important to recognize. Something else. So my why. So I am a student of critical race theory. Is anyone familiar with critical race theory? All right. Can you explain some of the tenets? You don't have to give me the whole dissertation, but can you explain some of the tenets of critical race theory? Good. Yes. Yes.
Critical?
That is critical. Okay. What else? That is just that race is a theory. Okay. Okay, so we talked about cultural construct. Yes.
I feel like it's a way in which kind of looking at a lot of things through the lens of kind of saying that these though helps us understand a lot of different concepts that it's not seen as if they have racial issues embedded in them as actually being very much.
Yeah. So critical race theory is it's simply race plus the law, plus the structures that support those other two things is critical race theory, right? So, so the law, so for a critical race theorist like myself, I back up against the law because that's where I get my teeth. That is my why, right? For a number of different reasons, and I'll point that out in just a second. So the law of the land gives us our why. It's our primary why. That is why the United States is such a great and glorious country. I love her. I appreciate her. But I also can hold her to task when she's not doing what we said we were going to do. And how do I hold her to task? By using the law. And what is the supreme law of the land? the Constitution of the United States. Some people say it's the Bible. I disagree. I think it is the Constitution of the United States. But anybody heard people say that? All right, we'll just drive by that. Well, yeah, you know, right? So our guidance in terms of our work first comes from the law of the land, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights as they are presented and as it is ever evolving, right? So, so we call this category of this critical race theory, getting to this why, we call this particular category civil rights, right? And what is the first civil rights bill kind of introduced into our governing laws? 1866, with the ratification of what? You can Google it. The 13th and 14th Amendments, right? And some folks are concerned that the 13th Amendment didn't end slavery. I would say it officially ended slavery. However, there is a clause that has been problematic, which is mass incarceration, right? So in some ways it shifted, but it legally changed it. It just augmented some things. Yes.
To go back further, so the negative would be the 3/5 of a person. And so that was civil, not rights.
Right. So yeah.
But it was great. What I'm trying to say though, it was
Yep.
and
Yep. So the law is, as far as I'm concerned, in doing this work, we have to understand what the law has done and what it hasn't done, right? How it's limited people's, but also how we've used the law to rectify those problems, right? So there is Executive Order 1066, which during the Second World War, that was the executive order that created camps for Japanese Americans, right? So that was a problem. There was, in the 90s, there was a rectification to that problem, so to speak, from the government's perspective, which was an official apology and some monetary compensation for that, right? As an attempt. But those are legal attempts to justify or honor people's civil rights. So we have 6 other sessions that we'll be doing, so we can really get deep into the weeds in this. But there is something that is important to recognize about these rights. So let me go through this, and then we'll come back and hit some of the broader points. So 1954, and this is a drive-by kind of thing, right? So we're breezing through American history. 54 is what? Brown versus the Board of Education, which creates the foundation for later arguments, as in the amendments for interstate travel, that people can, whatever, blah, 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 blah. That people of color and white folks can travel, can stay in hotels, can participate in all sorts of things. So there's that. 1964 is not quite the Voting Rights Act yet. The Civil Rights Act, right? So the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and fair housing come in 65, 66, which is great. I don't know why I skipped all the way down there, but and then 1920s is the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It does what? Gives women the right to vote. 1924, what happens? American Indians get citizenship in the United States without any other precursors. Before 1924, if you wanted to be an American citizen as a Native American, you had to sell your land and disown your tribe, your nation, your clans. 1970, Title IX. What does Title IX do? Yep. So gender equity in initially just in sports, but later in higher academic endeavors. So across the board, women have access. 1990s, what? The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And who was the Americans with Disabilities Act designed for? Physical disabilities, handicaps, okay? Please raise your hand if you plan on getting old. The ADA is for you, right? So is for you. And then in 2017, we have these FERPA laws, or these, anyone familiar with FERPA? But I make a special mention in 2017 around FERPA. FERPA is older than 2017, but why do I bring 2017 up as an issue as regards to FERPA? And can you tell us what FERPA is?
It's the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, I think it was. But it basically assures like student educational privacy. So you can't just call up a college and ask if someone is enrolled, and the school's going to be there to breaking the law.
Correct. Yeah. And so why do I, in 2017, why do I put FERPA as a benchmark for, what's that? Because of immigration? Yes. So it is about gender equity, right? So non-gender binary conforming young people in educational institutions are protected both in terms of their identity and how that is shared or honored or dishonored. Those are protected by FERPA. One could argue that it should be protected by other places, but this is the place where those protections lie, right? And that's why we kind of talked a little bit about gender pronouns and those kinds of things. Those are particularly educational institutions, and I would say that it extends to anyone who is engaging in federal funds and activities that these FERPA pieces could apply, right? So those are. So when I talk about this critical race theory, understanding the nature of civil rights becomes paramount to understanding why our organizations do what we do, right? So, so on page 6, I'd like for you to do this for homework, and this is making meaning. So on page 6, how does your organization talk about or identify the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion? So how does your organization define diversity? How does it define equity? And what is meant by inclusion? And so what I'd like to offer you is some ways to think about some of those things. For example, what do you recognize about these shapes? So some have a line in them.
They all start out 3 common shapes.
Okay, they all start out 3 common shapes. Yes.
None of the lines go outside the shapes.
Okay, so none of the lines go outside of the shapes.
They're all different, but they're all related to 1 or 2 letters.
They are all related, or they're all similar, but they're also what? Different simultaneously, right? Simultaneously. So they are different and the same simultaneously. So when we talk about this idea of diversity, one way to think about that is looking at our commonalities and our differences simultaneously. In terms of how many folks have been exposed to the IDI, right? So the IDI would suggest that looking at commonalities and differences falls in what aspect? What aspect of the IDI does that start to fall in?
Last category.
So it wouldn't be the last category. It's actually the middle category, which would be minimalization, right? Now, what I would suggest to you is that when introducing these kinds of concepts, it is good for us to start at the lowest common denominator. She said denial. I wouldn't go that far, but I would suggest that this idea of commonalities and differences gets us to a page where people can join us in the conversation, right? Because we can't deny that there are some things that we have in common. We can't deny that there are ways in which we're different. And so when we talk about the IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory, right? And you'll see an example of the model in your handout as well. So the IDI talks about that, and that is a tool. I would not say it is the tool, but it is a tool that can be helpful in understanding one's own development or an organization's development of intercultural competence. So these are very, very different and very similar simultaneously. So when we talk about diversity, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. Oftentimes, people also want to get equity and equality confused. And what I would suggest, again, getting people on the same page to kind of ride this, is that that equality is a step to equity, right? That equality is a step to equity. So first, all of these things were designed so example, the 13th Amendment, and even we go to this, so the 13th Amendment was to abolish slavery and give everyone the same rights. Because that wasn't happening, because this was about equality, and because people weren't getting those same rights, they had to become equitable. And so they started really redefining those things in 64, in 1990, in 1970. These are all ways of trying to get to equitable, to being equitable, even though we had equality, if that makes sense. Right? There are a number of ways other people have talked about that. Everyone gets shoes is equality. Getting the shoes that fit you is equity, right? So those are important things. And I would suggest that inclusion really talks about what are the bureaucratic barriers that we have created in our organizations that prevent people from participating that we can actually eliminate. Are there bureaucratic barriers that we can eliminate? And what is a bureaucracy? What is a bureaucracy?
In which generation?
It doesn't matter. I mean, you can Google it. Google bureaucracy. It's a concentration of power. Yes, it's a system for the exercise or operation of power. And it's run by who? Bureaucrats, right? So bureaucracies are run by bureaucrats. And who are those systems designed to benefit?
The bureaucrats.
The bureaucrats. So they set up the system, they run the system, and it's designed to benefit them. Are there systems in our society that are set up bureaucratically that actually don't work well for the people who use the system? Right? So she said the licensing bureau, right? No, so it's interesting. I don't know if many of you are old enough to know this term, banker's hours, right? Banker's hours.
Sure, the hours for everybody working, so you don't have access to it, because when you're off, the banks are off.
The banks are off, right? So there was a time when banks weren't open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They worked on time that benefited them.
The bureaucrats.
The bureaucrats, right? And so oftentimes in our organizations, we've created these bureaucracies that create artificial barriers. And when I say artificial barriers, so I'm not an anarchist. I do want to say that. So I believe that there are rules, and we need to have boundaries, and we need to have clear guidelines. But when those don't get back to our why, then I'm just making that stuff up, right? I'm just making that stuff up. So there's that. The other thing that I want to get to is on page, we're going to fast forward just a little bit to page 8. So because I use critical race theory and I look at civil rights, I look at what the law says about things, there are some ways of interacting in my organization that become important for me to realize. And this is where the rubber hits the road, where we split hairs and we decide what side we're on. All right? So there are two ways of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the first is impact versus intent. Impact versus intent. So I get that language from looking at discrimination and how discrimination gets played out, right? So I'm walking down the hall at work and someone swats me on my behind and squeezes, and we're not on the softball team together. What do we call that? Sexual harassment. And depending on the degree of it, it could be sexual assault, right? We call that sexual harassment. And what is the next step in dealing with that problem? A punch in the face. I don't encourage that. It may just cause more problems for you. But typically, what happens next? You make a report, and who do you report that to? To HR or to your supervisor, to HR. And then what does HR? Once it gets to HR, what is HR's responsibility? To do an investigation, right? So they look for the facts and all this kind of stuff. And as a person who has been injured by this, if you don't like how HR is proceeding with this, what can you do as an individual? You can go to the supervisor, you can report it, you can file with the state, you can get your own attorney, and you can take that to court, right? Now, what if during all of this process, the offender, the one who grabbed, says, you know what, I'm sorry, you just can't take a joke. I was just joking. Does that change anything? Why?
Still touched.
Because I was still grabbed, right? So the law measures the impact versus the intent. So when we talk about diversity, we talk about equity and inclusion. Is your organization one who is focused on the impact? And the way you know it is where diversity is housed, or how it functions out of where it's housed. So if we're focusing on the law and the impact, where in most organizations would you find diversity, equity, and inclusion work happening? HR, human resources, right? Human resources. And what laws are they trying to measure up so they don't have a negative impact? What things are they looking for out of human resources? Are they looking at competency? Hiring. So they're looking at hiring. What else?
Minimum legal requirements.
Legal minimum requirements. What else? Operations. You can say it again. Say it again. Trying to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're not dinged for discrimination. To be quite honest, I mean, if I can put it out there like that, right? So that's an organization that is focused on impact versus intent. Everything we're doing, we're trying to make sure we mirror our community, not necessarily because we think it's a good idea. We just don't want to get charged with discrimination, right? We don't want to be exposed like that, which is different than the second kind of organization. And I'm not saying that either is better or worse than the other, but the second kind of organization is intent versus impact. That intentions matter. And so in this organization, this type of organization, let me back up. Has anyone ever given or received a macaroni sculpture? Yeah, that counts, right? Yeah. Either received or macaroni. And when that person receives that macaroni sculpture, what place of honor does it reside? Where does it reside? On the refrigerator, where all fine art goes, right? And so when the person gives that piece of fine art and the person receives it, do they say, you know what? You should start a Pinterest. on how to do this, right? Do they say, you know what, let's put these on Etsy. Let's make a bunch of these and put them on Etsy. Is that the sentiment that people have when they receive that? Most commonly, probably not. But why do they put it on the place of honor?
To make the student feel good.
To make the student feel good. What else? Because of the relationship. Because of the intention. Because of the intention. Yes, please.
What happens when that background is like you got a sculpture that's pretty,
Yeah.
right? Like when you get it, I didn't give it to them, but it's like, okay.
Right. I don't even want to think about it.
As a sculpture at the Walker. Right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Like they so happy, but like now the person that receives double impact.
Yeah.
Now they're aware that that person became the you got to handle that, and you got to.
Yep. So this is a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. The line then becomes, where does this get balanced, right? So what's the balance between these two things? So how close is that to breaking the law, to having a negative impact? An example, I had a client who they were sharing some things at work, talking about their histories and that kind of stuff. And a woman brought one of those Tar Baby dolls. I don't know if you've seen those. It's a black doll with wild hair and whatnot that she had from her childhood, and wanted to share it with a coworker. And the coworker was away from their desk, so she just put it on her coworker's desk, and walked away. Problem, right? Pure intention, but really bad impact, close to breaking the law, right? So part of that. So first, that has to be determined, and then the second part is this something that can be fixed by relationship, or is it something that has to be fixed by the law, right? And when I say the law, I mean the HR process. Is that something that you can say, can you guys just talk that out, or is it something has it reached a threshold that says we have to deal with this with formal measures? One way to think about this is formal process, this is informal process. Yes.
Can you give me the context of the
Yep. So there are a couple of ways to think about that particular story. Is how is giving a doll, period, placing it on someone's desk, help us meet our organization's mission? So that's one way to think about it, right? So is that on-purpose behavior or off-purpose behavior? And I would suggest that placing a doll on anyone's desk without any other context is off-purpose behavior. So that's one way to think about it. Secondly, we can go to the race piece. In that particular situation, the woman who left the doll was a white woman, and she left it on a black woman's desk, right? So that's kind of a double thing, because not only is this off-purpose behavior, then we get into some other stickier places. But again, I would suggest that we pay attention less to, it is important to recognize the similarities and the differences. So race is important, but also the behavior itself needs to be taken into consideration regardless of or in regard to race, right? So it's both a part of the calculation and not at the same time, right? So there's that. So let's go to page 6 just for a second. Give me page 8, I'm sorry. So there are three categories that I kind of use to talk about how in organizations we work. So the first is this idea of affirmative actions. And these really are the formal processes that we use to do whatever our function is in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion work. And I use affirmative actions plural because these are all actions that are to affirm not only the civil rights of individuals, the Constitution, but also affirm their humanhood, right? So these are the laws. And so we want to make sure that we don't engage in discrimination when we're following this kind of legal structure. And there are legal recourses and legal things that people can use, like the ACLU or the NAACP, to get problems solved. When we talk about affirmative actions, we're talking about goals and measures. We're talking about how do we measure people according to the law. I brought an old example of one of my buddies, Anoka County's affirmative action plan, right? So this lays out for us the why. And the why is that we want to make sure that we're following the law and creating equitable environments. So the second category is this idea of intent. And this is where diversity and inclusion starts to come in. It is about the relationship. So intentions are really about relationships. So does your organization use its diversity, equity, inclusion as an engagement piece to help people share information, to operate, have better relations within the organization, how to design inclusive environments? Are there special focus groups, all of this kind of stuff to really focus on the building relationships, and diversity education, and you'll hear cultural competence, all those things. So sexual harassment is mandated by, sexual harassment training is mandated by law, right? So you don't get dinged. Cultural competence training is not. Right? So you can not do cultural competence training and not have any legal ramifications of that. But what do we also know? Why do we do it if it's not a legal requirement? What's that?
Because not doing it.
So not doing it sends a message?
Not doing it makes it more likely that you will end up violating the law in some way.
So not doing it could create something else, which is something we have to be mindful of, a hostile work environment. Right? Yes.
So that question for them, because some so they don't want to go down.
So sometimes people don't want to go down that path because it's not a legal requirement, right? Or that the truth hurts, or having these conversations about the history or past and all that kind of stuff is too painful. So if we don't have to do it, we won't do it. Right? Yes.
And also the key that people don't do it because they don't feel like they're supposed to. And so what they're afraid of is that they're going to make it worse by engaging in the conversation, so the status quo becomes better than what we don't know and what we're fearful of actually, like we can't have learned through.
Right. Yep. So some folks choose not to do that. And then the third category is really this idea of developing human beings themselves, right? So that's where sometimes, I know in Dakota County, they call them employee resource groups, employee engagement programs. They really want employees to learn how to be their best by engaging in conversation. And why might that be? Because it's not a mandate. What are they suggesting by having opportunities for employees to talk across cultural lines or within their cultural groups? What are they suggesting?
People are going to work better together when they understand each other and know more about their colleagues.
Yeah, so when they know more about their colleagues, they work more efficiently. Is the thought by whether that's true or not remains to be seen by the individual organizations. But the belief is that if we can get people to understand themselves more, they can be more effective, and they can increase their discretionary effort. And what is discretionary effort? Anyone heard that term before?
Choosing to engage.
Choosing to engage? Oh, okay, cool.
So working above baseline.
Working above baseline, right? So I get paid, if I work at 75%, I'll get the same Pay is if I work 100%. My employer would like 100%, but whether I get 75 or 100 is up to my discretion. And when I have better relationships in my workplace, I'm oftentimes able to give more of my discretionary out. Right? Cool. So on page 9, we start talking about what are some of the resource functions. And we talk about it as it relates to the law. And there are a couple of ways that I like to think about particularly these resource functions, and that's heterogeneous groups and homogeneous groups, right? Heterogeneous means what? Yep, lots of differences, right? Homogeneous means the same, right? And so how is your organization, and this is an assessment tool you can use to really think about your organization in terms of race or color, religion or creed, national origin, ancestry, gender identity, age, physical or mental ability, or veteran status. How is your organization in terms of being homogeneous and heterogeneous? What are those categories? Why did I select those particular categories? Because they're oftentimes on surveys. Why else? So they're usually measurable? Yes.
These are the things that all have legal protection.
These are the protected classes under the Civil Rights Act, right? So if you're doing well with these, then if these become your measures, then you don't have to worry about that legal stuff if you understand how you're doing with these protected classes. All right. Let's go over to page 11. So when we talk about this development of human relations, which is that third category on that chart that we looked at, the three different, the intent, impact, and then human relations. When we start thinking about human development of relations, I want to think that in using that model that comes from Milton Bennett, which is the gentleman who came up with the IDI or uses that model. That we look at this in terms of ethnocentric versus ethno-relative, homogeneous versus heterogeneous, and monocultural versus intercultural. So when we look at this human development, what we recognize is that there's denial, defense, minimization, acceptance, adaptation, and integration. And integration is kind of the holy grail in that people know how to interact with people who are different from them, going in and out of cultures effectively, and in some cases fluently. But it's a skill that can be developed. It's not necessarily something that someone automatically has. Okay? And so those are some important points to think about in terms of development. How effectively is your workforce in being able to interact with people who are different from themselves in ways that are effective? At my stage in my career and in my life, I am less interested in being right because I know that I'm right. But I'm more interested in being effective. Right? And so when I look at policies and procedures that I engage with, I oftentimes ask the question, am I being effective in what I do? Which means I have to be clear about what? Why? Right? So I have to be clear about why. And so eliminating those bureaucratic barriers and whatnot can be helpful tools in getting to that. So let's go to, I am not going to get through the rest of this thing by the end of today. So let's get to, page 16. The rest of those are worksheets you can do on your own, but page 16 are some things that I wanted us to highlight as we talk about these last three things. So 5 things to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a professional. One is know your passion, know what you're into, what energizes you, what doesn't. For some folks, doing affirmative action plans, doing these numbers, crunching the numbers, it's not what they're into. So be clear about what you're in for. If programming and education is your thing, then make sure that you're matching with your organization's need to get those things done. Know yourself. Those cards that we did and talked about our own journeys. Those are things that help us to understand ourselves. Adopt the philosophy of your work, right? So there's critical race theory. There is social justice theory, which is different than critical race theory. There are a number of other theories that we'll talk about in this series that you can use to kind of focus the work that you do, giving a particular lens. So that becomes an important thing. Know the numbers. Use data as your friend as much as you can. Use statistics of either accomplishments or disparities to kind of prove your point so you can point back to why, right? So there's always something that you can quantify, either the success or failures. And I think taking numbers on both is important, right? So you did a brown bag lunch. How many people attended? Did you do a follow-up? Well, what did that look like? Yeah, so those are things. Number 4, know the trends. We know that things are constantly changing. So stay up on constant changes. And you can do that by joining organizations that have, or joining formal organizations or engaging in community conversations that sharpen your skills. So the Wilder Foundation has a group called Reason, which is racial equity collaborative, where they talk about, and it's open to the community. So lots of diversity professionals go there. They iron sharpens iron. They have opportunities to learn. Facing Racial Equity Collaborative, FREC, is another one. They host a conference in November called the Overcoming Racism Conference. I know St. Thomas does the forum, and they have a number of pieces. So go out there, figure out, partner with other folks. Sometimes in this work, we can be so isolated that we actually miss opportunities to become better at our work. And so networking becomes extremely important. And then number 5, know who your leadership is, and know who supports you and how they support you, both in the big P of politics and the little p of politics. So if you have a backer that is on the board or in senior management, make sure you can continually communicate with them, that you work with them, and you work with them to try to figure out how to expand your influence. Because the more people understand the why of what you do, the more likely you'll be able to continually be effective in doing that. So there's that. So one of my key points that I wanted to point out is on page 20. And this is what I'll leave you with on page 20, because this is extremely important. But there is a difference between training, programs, and policy decisions, right? So there are certain things you cannot train. I want to put that out there, right? And particularly around these kinds of things. So sexual harassment, can you train on that? Yes, you can. You can train on sexual harassment. Will that training on sexual harassment heal the hurt between the harasser and the person who was harassed? No. So training doesn't cover everything. So there are certain things that you can train, which is skills, knowledge, and aptitudes, right? You can train on those things. When it comes to interpersonal relationships, you can't train on those things, meaning that the training won't heal the hurts caused by an impact. So in your organizations, how have you dealt with someone having an infraction on a policy or a law, and how have you healed that hurt? Yes, please.
Okay, most people punish the perpetrator in some way, but actually also end up very much.
And what does that look like in an organization? So what is the fallout of that particular way of engaging, punishing the perpetrator, but not dealing with the situation? You've seen people leave the job. It shuts it down. Apathy and separation. Fear. People are afraid to report anything.
Often the person isn't allowed to know what happened to the
Right. So this whole ambiguity of what the process was, because we have to legally protect so-and-so and blah, 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 right? So what I would suggest is that we also, what ends up happening is we end up with political correctness. I believe that political correctness did its job in the 90s to make people pause and think before they said goofy stuff. Right? Now I think it is a hindrance to actually communicating and sharing knowledge with folks. In that, people get so caught up in not saying the wrong thing that they don't say what they don't know what to say as a result. And I think that also happens in our organizations, where people get so caught up into not wanting to do things wrong that they forget or aren't mindful of doing things right. Yes.
Back on page 11, the ethical contract and related, it kind of in with the political correctness thing. This looks to me kind of like a trail of going from denial all the way to integration. And so when I look at the whole big world and all the different things, I don't always agree with everything, and I'm really comfortable in acceptance for those things that I don't necessarily agree with, and I don't really feel people do. But then there's that it feels to me like political correctness, because I actually need to adapt, but I also need to integrate. Otherwise, I'm not doing with it.
Yeah.
Can you talk?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. I believe, and this is just me, that there are costs and benefits to positions that we take, right? So in finance, what do we call that when you have $1 and you can spend it on this or you can spend it on that? What's that? Opportunity costs. Then we have opportunity costs, right? So if I choose to say, I'm in acceptance, that's good. Great. But is it possible that there's some things that you're missing because you're just in that particular place? Are there ways in which, again, I said, I'm at a phase of my life where I want to be effective more than I want to be right. So there are a number of things that I know I'm right about, but does that cause me to be effective? And so I would say if folks find themselves anywhere on this continuum, that they ask those kinds of questions. Are there things that I'm missing? Are there relationships? Are there ways I can be effective that I might be missing out on because I'm in this? I'm not forcing or suggesting that anybody have a particular answer to that question, but that we continue to ask the question of ourselves, right? Because I know there are tons of things that I miss. And I have growing edges all the time because I'm human, just like many of you. Some of y'all look so good, I don't think you're human, right? You just, yes, sir.
Along the lines of cost and benefits, sometimes we'll have good intentions again, but each thing up impacting maybe a person of color, right? For example, person of color is not affected by a decision that the person of color has no say in. Now, the leadership was white, but it's king and want to apologize or what have you, or talk. At least the leadership. So they've got multiple white people and maybe one person of color. the cost of benefit of that one person of color having to sit down and talk to multiple white people, to me feels like that costs them more time, more like energy, rather than just asking white leadership, just pick them up one-on-one and say, hey, we'd like to talk to them more and listen one-on-one if they want. Sometimes, it's just something new, and then what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you raised some good points. There's some nuances that I don't know about the big P versus the little p in terms of politics and political positioning in the organization. I will say that oftentimes the little elephant can't respond, doesn't feel the power or the or the influence to respond to the big elephant the way big elephants respond to other big elephants. Yeah. And oftentimes the big elephants are expecting the little elephant to respond to the big elephant the same way, but that power differential, perceived or real, is something that has to be taken into consideration. And so too often the little elephants are being expected and held to the standard that the big elephants haven't even talked about. Right? So I would say, if I had an opportunity to try and I use that kind of metaphor or to kind of talk about that, one thing that I'm not about is I hold people accountable, but I don't accuse people of it. Right? I ask lots of questions. I'm very Socratic in my approach. I hope you've been able to hear that. And so yeah, I would encourage.
Accusation.
Yep.
Right? We're talking. We don't like accuse. We acknowledge and address impact.
We address, acknowledge, impact. Right? And I would say, using these two models, what was the impact, and then what was the intent? Because people will say, "Well, I didn't intend to do that." That's cool. I got you. I know you didn't intend to do that. Way too long, right? And so you say, I know you didn't intend that, but this is the impact. But I didn't. Yep, I hear you. That's great. I know you didn't intend that, but this was the impact. So how do we resolve this impact? Do we resolve it through a relationship? Do you need to go apologize to that person? Or do we need to take this and talk to HR about blah, 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 blah? Yes.
If I'm alone in this, then let's not talk about it, but I struggle often with balancing being effective with feeling disingenuous. Like I'm constantly talking to people where I feel like to be effective, I have to pacify or placate, when in my head I'm like, oh my God, you're a hot mess, get out of my room. Right? And so that's a real sticking point for me.
And I don't know that I have an answer for that, because I feel very much the same way sometimes, right? One thing I have been able to do, and I will say it is 12 o'clock, and our session is now over. So feel free to leave, but I do want to just, if you could just give me 30 seconds so I can finish her statement, and then we'll be free to go. But I think that's the challenge of leadership, is how do you balance those two things, right? And so I would say when you feel like you're giving too much, then that might be a time for you to start checking where you are in doing what you're being asked to do. I know that someone said earlier that sometimes interacting with the world becomes political just because of who you are. I really don't have a choice, because people bring me stuff that doesn't belong to me and expect me to solve their problems. So I can tell them about themselves, or I can figure out a way to hand them off to the next person, which for some people may seem like I'm letting them get away with stuff, or I'm letting them walk all over me. And what I would say is that we all have doormats at our house, or had doormats, and they serve a purpose, right? So your feet are clean once you get to the next threshold. And so being a pushover is part of the business. Being tired means that you've been doing some work, right? Yeah, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Both kinds of cups are compostable, and if you're interested in finance, we're just starting a free networking lunch on surviving funding cuts.
I would say.